Well, let's get started. I want to ask you questions about sort of five different sets of things. But what I want to start with is what you're doing currently. So just tell us, what's a day like reporting in the White House? Start to finish. What does it look like?
Sure. Yeah, it's a difficult question to answer. Well, I guess no day looks the same, right? We have a team of White House reporters, and we rotate this thing called being, on duty. And if you're on duty, then your day could consist of basically going to the White House, going to the daily press briefing, going to different events that the president has, and sort of maybe if you're on duty, it's the more kind of reactive part of the job where the White House is announcing policy actions or the president is making comments and you are doing your role of documenting and asking tough questions and trying to cut through spin, but documenting. And then there's the part of the job which I think most people find really fulfilling too, which is you are digging, not as much sort of reacting, but trying to find out what is happening inside the White House or just throughout the administration that we don't know about. That could mean meeting with various sources or contacts. That could mean going to the Hill and trying to grab members of Congress to try and get them to give you an outside-in window into what's happening at the White House. And then there's also, a part of our job, I see the White House as a building, as an institution that's at the nucleus of American policy. But to cover American policy, you need to cover how it impacts people, right? So another part of our job that can be very fulfilling as White House reporters is to travel the country and see how the agenda is actually impacting people, right? There's also an international aspect. This beat has taken me also to, if you're covering something like migration, it doesn't start and end at the US-Mexico border, right? You gotta go to the region of Central America. That's a White House story that's connected to the White House. You may find yourself in immigration court. That's a White House story as well. So I have a broad view of it, but it's really never the same, Oh, it could also just be like sitting at your laptop all day, pulling your hair out, trying to write, and go through drafts and going back and forth with editors. I tend to think like a newsroom is still, I'm somebody who likes the fact that we're like back in the office, and increasingly going back to the office, because it also can be like just engaging in debate in the office and trying to talk with your colleagues about, the best strategy forward and the best way to sort of collaborate on stories.
I just want to drill down on what it's like to be in the White House reporting, because my impression, which is purely impressionistic, but it's that you've got this incredible ecosystem of journalists competing with each other to get stories. You're all hearing the same thing in a press briefing, but trying to figure out what your angle on it is. Presumably, a lot of your reporting happens in the White House as you interact with people who are actors there, right? And it's such a uniquely American thing in that you've got the press really embedded right in the actual building, right? And you said you think of it as a building, and then it kind of expands out from there, right? Is it like the most high pressure high school cafeteria ever that everyone's watching what everyone's doing, and you're trying to figure out who's working on what story and trying to work your angles, or is it something different? What's the best way to understand what it's like to be pounding away at your laptop in the White House?
It is incredibly high pressure. It can be competitive. Also, there's moments of being collegial too. I would also start with the premise of, I don't think I would be doing a good job at my job if I relied solely as the White House press briefing as the source for information. And that's really any beat. When I was covering the NYPD, like if I based my narrative or my story on a high-profile police shooting only by going to the press conference that a police officer gave, I don't think you're really doing your due diligence. In order to give the complete story of any institution on any beat, you really do need to like our editors that work outside in. I'm having meetings outside the building as well that can be just as meaningful, I think, to understanding the inner workings inside the building. But to get to your question, it is a unique room. You are surrounded by folks, there is a competitive aspect to this, and it can be a healthy competition. I sit in the White House press briefing next to USA Today, and then on the other side is the Washington Post, and in front of me are the TV networks. And throughout, and then you have your regionals and your local outlets as well. You have international correspondents as well. And I do think that that kind of healthy competition of hearing what other people, knowing that other people are working on something can be good motivation. But I do really stress too that it's almost the most visible part of the job, but I'm not sure that it's sort of maybe the heart of it,
Yep. Yep. Let me give you a chance just to adjust your mic, fellow.
Oh yeah, my bad. That's all you, my bad. You're good.
And what's the average day like at Mar-a-Lago? I mean, for a reporter, not
Yeah. So for Mar-a-Lago, we it's actually really. I've been in Mar-a-Lago once. Despite like what people think, when we're in West Palm Beach, where it's kind of a fortress. You can't just walk in, as a reporter, right? So I was in Mar-a-Lago once for a press conference that the president had during the transition. It's he has a certain style, in Mar-a-Lago that he's brought to the Oval Office as well. But that is also part of our job, this understanding that when you are a White House correspondent, you need to always be present, and this is something that carried over to other beats too. So that meaning that if the person you're covering is traveling, which he does often, and Joe Biden did too, President Biden, I was in Delaware a lot, the past 4 years because he often went to Delaware on the weekends. President Trump often goes to Mar-a-Lago, so we'll go to West Palm Beach just in case anything might happen. And you never know, when he greenlit the operation on Venezuela, that was one of those moments where we had a reporter there, and within hours the next day he called a press conference, or maybe it was the day after that, but we needed to have a reporter there to be able to go there and be in the room at that day.
And presumably, I presume many of the people you talk to move around with them.
There's also that aspect too of being present, right? Our job too is to seek understanding also of what's happening in this place. You need to also be where a lot of the people that are working for him and also that are sort of in the MAGA infrastructure in a way and in Trump world are, right? So, that it goes back to sort of being present there.
We had the chance to chat yesterday, and one of the things it was really interesting chatting, and one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot was your explanation of this process of cold calling the president. So after the president initiated action against Iran, you called him on the phone, on his cell phone, and just walk us through why you cold called him, why that's unusual, how we should understand that in the context of how you would normally.
Well, it's definitely unusual, right?
Yeah, and then how you wrote the story, like walk us through that whole process of journalistically what it was like to make the decision about why you were going to do that, and then how it ended up in a story in the way it did.
Yeah. Well, from our POV, from just my role, so I had covered the president in Corpus Christi on that Thursday. This is before the announcement of the start of Iran. I covered that day. We wrote a story on Texas primary and sort of what the president was leaning towards, and as far as that. And this is also a part of the beat. You're pivoting a lot. You're juggling a lot of stories. And then I woke up that morning, like probably many of you, to see the video on social media, right? Just as I was going to the airport to then go to West Palm Beach for my West Palm Beach duty because I knew that he would be going there. I thought it was important that before doing the cold call, I wrote a different story that day that I also thought was important. Kind of gave me a little bit, I think was essential to doing a balanced report that day. And that's that first before, we weren't the first to cold call him, and we didn't that first day. I was hoping that he had a press conference. I think that we would probably always, at least me as a reporter, I would prefer that he had a press conference. I think it allows for a range of reporters to ask questions. It allows for follow-up questions. And it's a little bit less on the president and the administration's kind of terms in some ways. We did a story initially just kind of putting a pin in it to tell the public, this is 24 hours after Iran, that already the president's communication style was different. It was unusual. He didn't do an Oval Office address. Usually history, even when a president is traveling, which happens when they're launching military action, they would usually go back to the White House, history would show. This isn't like just according to me, by the way. I did the reporting, talked to historians about this. I was really curious, like, how does one usually handle a situation like this in terms of communication? And the first thing I learned is, okay, like going back to Bush, going back to Reagan, going back to Bush Sr., like you have usually when presidents are away, they're gonna come back. You have your typical Oval Office address. Okay, if it's not 24 hours, it might be within 48. And then I kind of heard like the benefits, some people saying, well, look, you're doing a video on social media, that might just be adjusting to a new media landscape. I thought that was interesting, but just all to be said, before we called, I thought it was important that we did a story that said that he hadn't done a press conference and that he already was taking on sort of an unusual strategy for Trump as well, somebody who's pretty accessible when it comes to the media, and that he had gone behind the scenes, like he really wasn't speaking a lot. Then a day passed and we noticed he was doing all of these calls with other reporters. It became very clear he wasn't going to do a press conference. And then it was collaborative. You talk with your colleagues and sort of brainstorm different questions that you might ask as well. What's the scenario where if you call, it might only be a 30-second conversation? What's the scenario where it might be longer than that? You kind of have to prioritize your questions there. And then, once the interview happened, we also sort of faced a choice of the best way to sort of show that news. I did not think that the best route after doing that interview was to we have like the live briefing on our website, right? Where it can be like little paragraphs and bits and alerts and what have you, adjusting to a new media landscape. I've noticed others have, also tweeted and sort of put up on live social media, sort of their updates as the phone call, like right after the phone call. To each his own, and others can disagree, but like, I've really appreciated that we took a bit of a beat after the initial call. And instead of like posting in our live briefing, like individual quotes from the conversation, more so I took a minute to talk to my colleagues who frankly have been doing it longer than me. And we just talked a little bit about the conversation. And I came away with the takeaway that, yes, there's news. He did say that the intention was that this will go for 4 to 5 weeks. This is just like a day after this has started. Yes, there's news, and that he said his projections he saw showed that more U.S. service members were going to die. And also that he had 3 people in mind to lead the new Iranian government. But also there were so many contradictions, right? He said, the president said, I want the people of Iran to overtake their government, but he also said, I have 3 people in the current government in mind to lead the Iranian government. He said, I want the Iranian security forces to drop their weapons and surrender, but I asked him, who do they surrender to? And he said, the people. Well, they were, targeting and shooting the people earlier this year. He kept bringing up Venezuela as a perfect scenario for Iran. All of this is in 6 minutes. Like, he kept bringing up Venezuela. Venezuela would be the perfect scenario. Venezuela is so starkly different than Iran, right? It's such a different scenario, both this operation and just the country in general. So we ended up, after that conversation, going with the story. I don't know the exact words of the headline offhand, but I believe it was, Trump lays out visions fully in conflict with one another and contradicting one another. We put the news up there, but we went with context. And I do think that context that I just laid out, basically. And I think, based off of the feedback that I got, that it left the reader with a takeaway of, there's not really a clear vision for the way forward immediate after this. And that, to me, was the biggest sort of takeaway from that call. So I thought, I guess, in a long-winded way, the call was important, but also the way that we reported that news was too.
Which you wouldn't have gotten if you had subscribed to this kind of, at the moment, TikTok of the call, saying here he said these, just reporting exactly what he said verbatim doesn't draw out.
And it's tough to compare. Like, sometimes you need to get the news out there too, right? Sometimes you see the news and it's it's tough to put myself in the shoes of somebody else, but like, sometimes you're speaking to somebody and the breaking news is so important that you feel you'd be doing the public a disservice to not get it out quickly, right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
it really is case by case.
How was it decided that you would be the person to call? I mean, it's a pretty heavy-hitting list of New York Times reporters in the White House team,
Yeah.
right? So what's the
It's very
dynamic? where
collaborative,
everyone,
though.
Yeah, no, I bet it is.
Even
But
when-
how does that work?
Even when you call, though, I mean, you've got the backing of your colleagues
For sure.
behind
Yeah,
you. You're
yeah,
discussing with your colleagues as well. I had colleagues that I spoke to, beforehand too. I've really been lucky to like have someone like David Sanger on
Yeah,
my team
yeah,
who
yeah.
is just got so much wisdom and experience with these things, and even somebody younger who's in this like Tyler Pager who had previously called the president after Venezuela, right? And as well to Maggie Haberman as well. So you may be the person like picking up the phone and doing it, but it's like incredibly collaborative.
But there's got to be some strategy for how you do it, right? Is that the idea? Like, do you?
Yeah, and I don't know. You'd have to ask my editor. Maybe it was just because I had been on the plane, nonstop from it. But I suppose that if anyone's like interested in journalism here, like you put yourself in that position by also the trust you build beforehand with your editors, right? When you're doing the daily story, when you're doing going to the White House and doing other stories that maybe aren't the one that's going to get the most attention, like you build that trust of your colleagues by approaching each and every sort of daily story like it's that high stakes, right? Like it's that type of high stakes moment. So I'd like to think I built the trust with my colleagues to be able to be put in that position. But I would really say like it's collaborative. It's collaborative.
Evidently, right? How did you become a reporter?
Okay, so I think that I was always instilled with a sense of curiosity. I have a mom who is a painter and a lovely poet on the side and a healthcare worker, and she told me to journal when I was growing up, and I think there's that aspect of it. My aunt who's here is a journalist as well. She anchors a show on NPR called Here and Now, and had a show called Evening Magazine in Boston as well. And then also there's a Register Forum alum here too, which my high school newspaper, this is a small world as well. So I really credit my high school newspaper for it. But I think I had a love of writing. I had a love of stories. I'm really curious about people. And I do think there's still room to like continue to be curious about people. And, I do think probably later on in college, I started to become attracted to the type of accountability, sort of watchdog news journalism that I'm involved with now and sort of beat reporting. I think it started with stories, storytelling. In college, I was quick to do internships. I majored in journalism, but I actually don't think majoring in journalism is a requirement, which is probably good because I don't think journalism is a major here, right? Or you have it as, which I actually don't think it's necessary, like if you need to do it.
Any person, any study, but not journalism.
Yeah, I actually, if I could go back, I don't know if I would major in journalism. Like I think you learn this by doing it, doing internships. I was at the Boston Globe. I worked along some titans, just watching them, and I took a semester to go to South Africa. I worked for the Cape Times in Cape Town, South Africa. And then I went to the Wall Street Journal, where I learned from some great editors and reporters, but started with loving stories, being curious.
So coming to now, I mean, what's really remarkable to me about your journalism is that you are, I think, you do two things at once. You're a exceedingly good beat reporter, as you say. You can do do the watch duty at the White House and write whatever needs to be written. But you've developed expertise in actually a bunch of overlaying areas of interest: immigration and migration, crime, homeland security. A lot of those things you're working at the nexus of them now. Yeah. But how do you think about the balance between being a specialist and being a generalist? As a journalist, how do you work at actively maintaining both of those identities? Do you think of yourself as one more than the other? How have you gotten to this place where your craft has these different components in it?
Oh man, great question. I kind of go back and forth with this because I think there's various ways to sort of do this job. There's no like one formula at it. You have great White House correspondents that are maybe better writers than they are reporters. You have some that can do both. You have great narrative journalists, and then great like scoopy journalists that are just dropping news, and then those that can do it all, right? And then you have like this also choice, not choice, but like when you're a White House correspondent, I had somebody tell me that being a White House correspondent is like being a general assignment reporter, but just on a really like under a spotlight, you know, and on a big platform. And I think there's an element to that. We have a rule on our White House team that you have to be able to cover everything. When I moved to the White House team when Joe Biden was elected, I had only like kind of the typical sort of like way you join the White House team, or like conventional way might be you cover campaigns historically, then you go to the White House beat. I had never covered a campaign except like the de Blasio, Malliotakis mayoral campaign, right? So I didn't really have experience that way. I came from more of a policy reporting background. And the two people that joined the White House team under the Biden, when Joe Biden was elected, they took Jim Tankersley, who had been covering economics, and myself, who had this like immigration, homeland security background. And I think the thinking there was you can do accountability journalism by also pressing on policy, you know, by pressing on issues, you know, as well. So that was kind of my window into it. But we have a rule now, while you may have expertise and you may have a mini beat, and you can have that. You can definitely rely on that. You can fall on it. But you got to lead with being able to do anything. You know, Sanger, who's written like, I don't know how many books he's written, but a bunch of books on national security, is a preeminent national security reporter, is also willing to go cover like an economic speech, right?
Yes.
I have had to learn about, you know, what more about tariff policy, and especially this year, right? And you know, and tax policy. In a way, I think probably the best thing about the White House beat is you get to cover everything. And one day you're covering a Texas primary, the next day you're covering Iran, and then the next day you're covering the ousting of a Homeland Security secretary, and covering migration. But also the most challenging about the White House beat is you need to cover everything, right? You need to do all that and not just kind of BS it when it comes down your way.
And people read what you write.
Yeah, definitely. I would hope.
It's got to be right. What was it? So you came into the White House. Your first reporting gig there was under the Biden administration. You've carried over to Trump. Just what are the differences? But I mean, they're very different people. But what are the differences like in the culture of reporting, in your experiences in those, and what are the things that are common in trying to cover both of those quite complex figures?
Common or different?
Well, both.
Yeah. I mean, they're two completely different administrations. In many ways, I mean, the Trump administration round 2 is different than Trump round 1.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah.
I mean, like the obvious one is Biden, you know, obviously, let's start with press relations, right? You know, you have this dilemma where Biden, and we wrote about this, was, you know, very much bubbled off. And he did not speak to the press, as just based off fact, historically, as much as other presidents. I think one print interview over 4 years, something around that. I think it was to the AP. Maybe that's only legacy outlets. So that was a different challenge where you are trying to pierce an administration and find out what is happening inside administration that is not visible, where the president is not as visible as previous administrations before him. The Trump administration, President Trump, is in many ways incredibly accessible. We just talked about one example. He does all of these gaggles, right? You can't say that he doesn't make his time available to answer questions, but you also have a torrent of all these misleading and false claims heading your way. So also it's not as simple to say that, you know, one is great or bad at transparency, right, in that way, because I do think, you know, being visible to the press matters, but also presenting accurate information, you know, as well matters. So that's one difference. Then there's just pace of news. We are seeing an unrelenting pace of news, you know, in this administration. Depending on where you are, you may like or not like that, right? But I like to say that, you know, coming into last year, you probably remember, I mean, it seemed like every day there were like 6 executive orders, right, between January and April. It wasn't 1 year's worth of work, right? You know, Biden leaves office and they got to work, you know, over those 4 years. Stephen Miller forms the American First Policy Institute, begins recruiting different attorneys and lawyers with this idea of we are going to bring people in that can execute on the president's wishes, right? I believe President Trump has said that one of his regrets of, or I know he said that one of his regrets of the first term is listening to a sort of Priebus and other sort of establishment Republicans that said to keep the sort of people that he grew to view as bureaucratic hurdles, as establishment Republicans that stood in the way of his agenda. Well, you square that with now this transition where the president conducted, or his team conducted loyalty tests, right? I say this because I think the pace of news also translates to the fact that you saw an administration conducting loyalty tests for people that could come in to round 2 with the purpose of, will you say yes? You know, usually government has a back and forth. It's actually set up for a system of having a system of checks and balances and dissent, you know, and a slow pace, you know, for policymaking. That, by the way, frustrates, you know, a lot of people too. This administration was designed to get rid of that slow pace and push out executive orders, even if it meant not eroding or straight up cutting some of the legal checks and some of the checks and balances on the executive branch, right? This is unitary executive theory that we're talking about, and I think it directly sort of relates to the pace of news. For us, what that means is we have a greater challenge and responsibility, I would say, to not only cover the flood of news heading our way and do it fairly and accurately with accountability and fairness and curiosity still at the centerpiece of what we do, but to also continue to follow up, you know, on stuff that has already happened. That gets really, that's a challenging, it's always been a challenging task, but it's a challenging task when you have so much breaking news happening each and every day. It even makes it more important for us to follow up on what has previously been announced or a promise that was previously made that we have to get around to checking on if they made good on it.
This seems to me to be the argument for wanting to have people who are a mix of subject matter experts and generalists, right? That you've got, I mean, you probably sort of keep watch on stories around migration and Homeland Security, and you can say what they're saying today and doing today is contradictory with what they were doing 6 months ago.
Yeah.
And a generalist might just not pick up on that through line, right? Because they're just not into the weeds of the story.
Having the specialty, it can be really beneficial to basically saying, like having a sort of light go off of, wait a minute, they just said that thing, but I remember, you know, them saying something that was contradictory to that before. And it's also because of your contact list. You're talking to people in these worlds, even when you're not writing the daily story, who can sort of alert you to some of these things as well.
So you and I have spoken a little bit about the kind of the expectations in writing, and I want to figure out the best way to formulate this, but it's that, you know, you work for a paper that's got a certain audience. It's very broadly read, but it's got a certain audience. Mm-hmm. They have certain beliefs about who these people are that you're covering, and the people are different than their beliefs, as accurate as they might be. They expect you to write stories in certain ways, you know, and those expectations aren't always consistent or fair in some ways, right? So, you know, we talked a little bit about the Biden thing, right? That after the debate between Biden and Trump, in which Biden appears to be, I don't know if addled is a fair word, but he appears to not be vigorous. People sort of say, you know, I mean, why weren't you reporting on this stuff? And you say, well, we were reporting on it, but you didn't want to hear it in some ways, right? So how do you think about these competing expectations about who people think these people are, and then how they want you to report on them as a result, and then how you think you should report?
I'm glad you said we reported on it too.
You did, yeah.
Front page piece, 2022, you know, long before the debate, right? But look, to an extent, I mean, you obviously you want to hear feedback from your audience and your readership. That's one way in which you're getting a window into sort of the national sentiment and how people are feeling, right? It's one way. But you also cannot be guided completely by what your audience wants to read, right? You really, the guiding principle has to be the reporting, you know, and and just going where the information goes. I think there's like, I kind of try to bring up this example, like if we, maybe like if it seems like kind of this might be what you're getting at, like are you ever kind of dictating reporting based off of what your audience wants to read in a way? I don't know if like, I like to say the New York Times has, I think, done incredible, like really accountability-driven work on the Trump administration. I also was a part of stories on Biden's age. I know my colleagues also were the ones that broke the Hillary Clinton email story. And I think that sometimes cuts against the narrative of you're writing specifically for a particular audience. You go by the feedback that I've always gotten from my editors is report,
Yes,
and keep an
yes,
open mind,
yes.
and go where the reporting leads you.
So let me put the question. Let me put the question this way because it's not well formulated. But we always want journalists to be fearless in the face of the people they're reporting.
Yeah.
Right. But as a journalist, how do you be fearless in the face of what your audience wants? Because as news becomes more siloed, right? What the average modal reader of the New York Times would love to read is a hypercritical story of Donald Trump all the time, right? And the average Fox News viewer would love to have watched a hypercritical story of the Democrats all the time. But reality is somewhere in the middle, right? So how do you? That's kind of what I'm asking about. How you think about what, how does reporting sustain itself in the face of that audience demand for caricature?
Yeah. Well, one, I think maybe I'm an optimist, but I think our audience wants to read good investigations, that give them a deeper understanding into the world. I almost kind of don't go with sure it's true maybe for some, but I almost wonder if it would be generalizing just to say, even for our audience, they only want to read something through one political lens. And even for like a Fox News audience, they only want to read something through one political lens. Like I remember, Peter Doocy, challenged. He's asked some tough questions, of Republicans as well. And so I don't know. Like for me, it's you have to really just focus on sort of the reporting and listen to your audience, but also not let that dictate you. I mean, there is I think what we have to remember is you use the word fearless. And I think there was a quote that our previous editor, Dean Baquet, said, which is like, our job is the uncompromising pursuit of the truth. And the truth can like challenge people. It can make people uncomfortable. It can result in a lot of hate mail. But that's the uncompromising pursuit of the truth requires at times writing about topics that people will question. Why are you writing about that? Why are you putting so much time in it? The other part of our mission is also seeking to deepen people's understanding of the world. These stories are out there in the world. People exemplify views that might be at odds with your own values as well. How you do that and where you have rigorous fact checking and what have you, I think that's something you need to think about. But I don't really think it requires turning like a blind eye to people exemplifying certain views. I don't think that's productive.
I want to ask you about your areas of expertise. How should we understand this moment in American immigration policy and what's happening with migration? Give us your big picture view of what's happening.
Yeah.
Because there's so much day to day happening that's all important, but what's the big picture we should be seeing?
I mean, I think you have to look at the current state of America's immigration system going back. Like this is in many ways the result of congressional dysfunction going back decades, right? We have not had comprehensive immigration reform. I guess you got close like during Bush, really since like Reagan, you got close. I mean, people would say you got close in 2024 with the Langford bill, but really that was just a border security bill. It really wasn't comprehensive immigration reform. I would say regardless of who I talk to on the Democrat or Republican side, most people agree that the system's incredibly broken. When you have a situation where somebody who crosses the border, you may think that person, some people, depending on their politics or regardless, might have the viewpoint that it needs to be harder for that person to cross the border and they should not have the chance to get asylum. Other people should say there should be more improvements to actually improve that person's ability to get relief. But the fact that like right now, I think the last I checked, it takes around 3 to 4 years to get a decision, in that case. And that's because you have about still, I think, a more than 3 million backlog in the immigration court system. Congress hasn't been able, even during the Biden years, wasn't able to come together to actually provide funding for immigration judges. Whether you're pro-immigration or pro-relief or pro-enforcement, how can you not like believe in also funding for judges, the people that would make the decision, right? And there's not enough of those right now. So I would just start like with that premise that I actually think sometimes we make too much of like what we all disagree on. And like I find that just in my reporting, there's agreement that like something needs to be done, and often the finger points to Congress. I would say just in terms of immigration, I'm not sure in some ways you can be surprised by the pace and the extent of where we're at. In other ways you can't be surprised when it comes to President Trump. Like he said what he was what he was going to do like during the campaign. He talked about mass deportations. He talked about considering the Insurrection Act, or at least his aides did. In term 1 during the transition, he talked about constructing the border wall. This is something that he's been he's been upfront on. But now we're at a time where we saw Los Angeles, Chicago, and Minneapolis. We did not see in term 1 the type of redirecting federal agents from other sort of federal agencies to also assist ICE. You now have FBI analysts, at times DEA, ATF, and Bureau of Prisons that have been redirected to also assist ICE in these operations. I would say that it looks like Minneapolis was a flashpoint, It does. The administration has talked about targeting the worst of the worst throughout, Trump round 2 and this time in office. Data analysis we did through October 15th found, I believe, 7% of those detained by the administration had a violent criminal conviction, 33%, I believe, a no criminal conviction, right? So that doesn't really back worst of the worst. It doesn't back that this was targeted either when you see some of the operations. I'm starting to hear increasingly from Republicans as well as Democrats that a course correction was needed. I don't know if that's always sort of the actions that happened on the ground or if that's the political backlash that's ensued. And also you talk about sort of the leadership battle at the Homeland Security Department with Kristi Noem, Corey Lewandowski, Greg Bovino, and Stephen Miller as well. But I would say we're at an interesting point. Up until this point, it was sort of full throttle, continue to accelerate, continue to push with these deployments. It seems like we did a data analysis recently. There's been a little bit of a decline in arrests, about 11% since the start of the year. We're not seeing as much of these sort of deploying of the full arsenal of federal agents, to these cities now. However, I would also say, I think often what gets a lot of attention, possibly rightfully so, is the deployment of these federal agents to American cities. What it gets a little bit less attention is this administration often says that they are only targeting immigrants without legal status. Reporting just shows that isn't true. When the refugee cap, the State Department's refugee program, had a cap of 125,000 at the end last year of Biden. Refugee admissions are completely suspended, with the exception of white South Africans that have been allowed into the country, a couple hundred of them. That's legal immigration. The administration has stripped TPS, as well from Haitians. They have also moved to strip also refugee status from people that were already in the country with legal status. You've seen $100,000 fees also on different sort of employment visas. So look, there's often like a debate over, and I totally fine. Like there's a debate over the validity of these programs, whether they go too far, or whether they go, whether the Democrats have overshot on them, whether too many people are allowed in. Okay, sure, but just in terms of legal and illegal, like that's a fact check, right? Like this has impacted both legal and illegal immigration. There's probably a lot more on a complicated subject to get to on that, but it's just like a quick, answer to you.
No, and I know the audience is going to have questions on it, I'm sure. And what about the related area around Homeland Security?
Yeah.
How should we understand what's, obviously they're getting a new secretary, but when you talk to experts in that, how are they thinking about this agency and how it's evolved and whether it's effective or not and what it should be doing and shouldn't be doing? How should we understand the Department of Homeland Security in the Washington ecosystem?
We did an investigation late last year into, I covered DHS in term one, and now I still like help out covering it and from the White House team and with my colleague Hamed Ali-Aziz, who's fantastic and you should all follow, very great reporter. But in term one, the administration took this is a department that's very young. You know, we have to remember that. Homeland Security Act of 2003, in the wake of 9/11, you bring all of these different federal agencies together under one umbrella with the idea of, you know, protecting U.S. borders, bringing TSA, Border Patrol, FEMA, and ICE, you know, as well, right? Very young agency with agents with a lot of authorities, a lot of different legal authorities as well. In term one, I think what we saw is taking an agency that is responsible for disaster relief, immigration enforcement, cybersecurity, which gets forgotten about a lot, protecting the president, Secret Service, as well as other TSA, maritime as well. And you saw like a real focus to prioritize on immigration enforcement. Not just by rhetoric, not just by sort of directives, but taking, in some cases, FEMA money and transferring it to border wall funding, right? I think you have seen that accelerate, that trend. Not I think, the reporting shows that you have seen that accelerate in term two. We have reported that HSI agents, which are, ICE actually has two branches. You have ERO, which does deportations in cities, and then you have HSI, which think like El Chapo investigation, think long-term cartel investigations, sex trafficking, child exploitation. We found that many of those agents have been redirected to do the routine civil immigration enforcement, right? We found, and I mentioned the FBI analysts before, Office of Intelligence of Analysis. This is an office in DHS that really works to get at the main purpose of what DHS was founded for, communicate between state and local law enforcement agencies. They have been focused to refocus their intelligence work, maybe less so on domestic terrorism, more so on immigration enforcement too. So what you're seeing is the president's rhetoric, which focuses on immigration, has been matched by a redirecting of federal resources to approach this as if it's a top threat to domestic security. At least that's how they've appropriated the resources.
I've got 5 more questions. 4 of them are really quick, genuinely, and then we're going to turn over to the audience. But I wanted to ask you a personal question. And I learned in the course of preparing for this about this short movie you made in 2016.
Yeah.
And for those who don't know, the topic of the movie was that the origin of the movie, in some sense, was that you knew and were friends with one of the brothers who was the so-called Boston bomber.
Yeah.
And the short film is about the people discovering that a friend of theirs has done something horrific. And I just wanted to know how you thought you did when you were young, and how you thought about the task of telling a story about someone you knew well to people who didn't know that person, right? And knew them very, very differently, and whether any of that carries over into how you think about your work as a journalist.
100%. I mean, I think at that time, one part was, you're looking for catharsis. I find that storytelling and exposing yourself to some of the, exposing yourself to the actual troubling things happening around you through storytelling and documenting it. I find it it's a privilege, but it's also cathartic, right? Rather than turning a blind eye to it. But also, I think that even at that time, I was an intern at the Globe, and I remember even, some of the initial, not at the Globe, but some of the initial sort of chatter online being like, oh man, this guy was probably another lone wolf. This guy, us attaching the quick kind of attempt to make sense of a chaotic situation by attaching the labels that we know well on it. This guy must have been bullied. He must have been a loner. Truth was, he wasn't, right? It was an uncomfortable truth, but he really wasn't. And I think that this maybe brings us full circle, I think, to a question that you had earlier. It's really important to get the truth out there even when people don't want to hear it, and even when it complicates people's narratives, to say, hey, I know it would be comforting to otherize, that might not be a word, that person, but actually, what's much more the more difficult truth is he was one of us, you know, he was a neighbor, you know. And how can we like move on, especially as these events keep happening too, if we tell ourselves that just that person is the other, right? And as a way of catharsis, as a way to sort of get over it. Isn't it much more difficult to actually be presented with the truth that this person might have grew up near you too? I mean, I would think that that's part of our mission of giving people, like informing people the best way we can about the country they live in. If I could just add one more point to that.
Please.
I think it also like, sort of like when I was covering terrorism too, I would ironically go to cover terrorism like years after that. And I didn't notice that like there's a certain pattern you have when a terrorist attack happens of like, breaking news event happens, and now let's get the profile of the victim, the profile of the perpetrator, and the sort of TikTok narrative of like how it happened, right? There's a lot of people in between, you know, those labels, right? You know, so it helped me too, I think, when like I would be the guy, I had to go door knock somebody who, after the Chelsea bombing in New York 2017, I had to go door knock somebody who was my age when the Boston bombing happened. And I was a reporter now. I remember like reporters showing up to my house too. And like this kid, like at one point was like, do you think like why should I talk to you? Like people are gonna keep coming. And I like honestly told him, one, you don't need to talk to me. And two, if you don't, that doesn't mean somebody else won't come. And three, I personally think it's better to fill the void of information with your own truth, you know? So.
Thanks very much for talking about that. Your favorite journalist, living or dead?
That's funny. I know I should put, yeah. Robin Young, living. Oh man. Man, I don't know. I mean, can I just say like a couple off the top of my head?
Yeah.
Total dodge.
You're the guest. You can do whatever you want. Yeah.
All my colleagues at the Times that have ever like helped me confirm something. I really admire my colleagues. Wesley Morris, that might be like a twist, but man, I think Wesley Morris in the New York Times style section is so good. Such a good writer. If you can, go back and read his piece he wrote about his mustache. I know this might sound weird, but like go back and read the piece he wrote about his mustache during COVID. And it's actually like incredibly serious and deep, but it's one of my favorite pieces that's been done. And I just finished Say Nothing by Patrick Radden Keefe, and that's journalism. Yeah, about the IRA
it's a great
and the
book.
troubles, and oh my goodness, that's a great book. In the past, I mean, you know, like I remember editors giving me Jimmy Breslin's book. James Baldwin, I think, is a journalist. Red Smith, I got into this through sports journalism. Bob Hohler, Boston Globe reporter as well. Oh man, I'm probably missing a bunch, but.
If you could recommend one book to Cornell students, what would you recommend?
Okay, but like, there's other books I would recommend. This is off the top of my head, right? I feel like The Fire Next Time like really meant a lot to me in terms of telling one's truth. That's not like just for journalism either.
No, generally.
But I would go The Fire Next Time. Say Nothing was good, man. I would go with that.
Great book.
You know, I still love In Cold Blood, even though there's some factual inaccuracies, it seems, there, and the reporting might not have been. I would go with those.
Greatest sports book ever written?
Showtime. I love Showtime. No, King of the World. That's the book I would recommend. King of the World by David Remnick. Yeah, Muhammad Ali.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's
Muhammad Ali basically traces Muhammad Ali's like rise, but also what's happening in America, you know, during each of those times. So I would go David Remnick. That's also my answer to the previous question.
Okay. The correct answer is The Game by Ken Dryden, but let's move on.
Have you read King of the World?
No, but there's another question. The best story you've ever written?
I don't know. I have no idea.
What's the one you're proudest of?
Probably a couple different ones. I mean, there was one collaboration the New York Times did with the, I believe it was the El Paso Times. I thought that was cool because we did like a national local collaboration for an investigation, realizing that we maybe lacked some expertise that we needed. And this was 2019, 2020 or 2019, post family separation, zero tolerance, but still a record amount, 2019, of people crossing the border. We had gotten tips, and these lawyers went into immigration detention facilities, finding that detention facilities built for, maybe like 10, 12 men, if that. There were like 30, minors, in these facilities. So I appreciated this experience because we did a quick story like on lawyers that were given access there and came out. And you might remember the quotes. It was like, there's no soap, there's no toothpaste, right? So then this was an example of following up. We get all called into a meeting and everyone's getting different tasks. And we realized like, the story's been written, we could move on, but there's probably a lot there. I was only a couple months in at the Times, and one of my editors was like, I remember I was like, I know a lawyer that can reach out to like maybe some people that have been released, the people that have been released. It's like, no, you like have a maybe more challenge, like you have the job of, you need to talk to Border Patrol agents that work there and try to get some of them to talk to you. And through various reporting steps, we were able to do that. And I think it gave me some good lessons, I mean, one, like we can't go into this with assumptions, that was a really rough situation at the border, but I'll tell you, I talked to agents themselves that were getting, villainized at the time that like opened up and were really emotional to me on the phone about what they were seeing. And that story couldn't have been done without people being brave enough to talk about what they were seeing. What that story ended up being an investigation that found that like there was outbreaks of diseases in the Clint facility. One person, a young woman, threatened to take her own life. Border Patrol agents also were coming home saying that like they couldn't stand the scent of themselves too. We found also that the Border Patrol had been like flagging all of these violations. You got 30 people. There was a young woman taking care of a baby that she wasn't related to, and they couldn't find the baby's family. Like this Border Patrol had told their superiors too. And we found that actually, those superiors did not act on it. Teaches you, man, like people are caught in the middle of this stuff that often get caught up in the political rhetoric between the two parties. That story ends up getting was on the front page of the El Paso Times and the New York Times, and then was read out loud during congressional hearings too. And they ended up passing like all this funding to basically, I think, help get clear out a lot of those facilities.
We're very lucky to have you here as the Zubrau Distinguished Visiting Journalist. Join me in thanking Zolan Kanno-Youngs.